Welcome back to Lost Scrolls Archive. This is a story about a list. Not a list you will find in any library, not one compiled by any modern hand. It is a list that was pressed into wet clay somewhere in ancient Mesopotamia, in the Flat River, plains between the Tigris and Euphrates, sometime around the 17th century before the Common Era. The clay dried centuries past, then millennia. Cities rose over it, crumbled, and rose again. Floods came. Empires dissolved, languages died, the tablet was buried. Then in the year 1889, a team of archaeologists working on behalf of the British Museum excavated a site in what is now southern Iraq near the ancient city of Sippar. Among the objects they unearthed and catalogued that season was a palmized clay tablet, its surface dense with wedge-shaped impressions, its edges worn, but its text still legible. It entered the British Museum's collection under the number 78941. A second tablet, 78943, contained its continuation. Together, they formed part of a set of 3 tablets carrying one of the most unusual texts ever recovered from the ancient world. The text was eventually identified as a version of what scholars now call the Epic of Atrahasis, the Babylonian flood story, older than Genesis, older than the Book of Job, one of the oldest continuous narratives ever committed to writing. Scholars translated it. Journals were written about it. Academic careers were built around its flood sequence and its creation passages. But buried in those same tablets, not in the flood section, not in the famous creation scene, where the gods fashioned the first human being from clay and divine blood, was something that most of the popular literature passed over in something close to silence. A passage in which the gods did not create humanity. A passage in which the gods reduced humanity. A passage describing in plain administrative language the deliberate dismantling of capacities that human beings had once possessed. Somewhere right now you are lying down in the dark. Maybe the room is quiet. Maybe there is a faint sound, the hum of something mechanical, the distant suggestion of wind. Wherever you are, whatever time it is where you are listening from, drop a comment. Tell us the city, the country, the hour, because what you are about to hear crosses every one of those coordinates and arrives from somewhere much further away. The Epic of Atrahasis, BM 78941, contains within it the record of a decision, a discussion among divine figures about what humanity should and should not be able to do, about which abilities served the divine purpose and which ones did not, and about what would happen to humanity once those abilities were removed. That decision is what this investigation concerns. There are across the cuneiform record, across multiple independent texts, excavated from different sites, translated by different scholars, across nearly 2 centuries of work. 7 distinct categories of human capacity that the Sumerian and Babylonian textual tradition describes as having been either withheld at the moment of creation, removed at a later moment, or deliberately kept behind the locked doors of divine storehouses to which humanity was not given a key. 7 human abilities, 7 points of reduction. The texts that describe them include the Epic of Atrahasis, currently in the British Museum, the myth of Adapa and the South Wind, fragmentary tablets from Tel Amarna, and the Library of Ashurbanipal, the myth of Inanna, and God Enki, which lists over 100 divine attributes held in a kind of celestial inventory. The Sumerian king list, inscribed on the World Blundell Prism, now held in Oxford's Asholean Museum. The Descent of Inanna, excavated from Nippur and housed today in the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago. The Eridu Genesis and the Epic of Gilgamesh, Tablet C, in which a man who once touched immortality has it taken from his hands while he sleeps. None of these texts were written by the same hand. None were found at the same site. None were composed in the same century. And yet, they orbit the same set of questions with a consistency that once you notice it is difficult to look away from. The central question this investigation explores is this: did the Sumerians believe that what we are, our intelligence, our lifespan, our perception, our connection to something larger than the visible world, is not the full version of what humanity once was? Did their texts describe not a species gradually building toward its peak, but one that had been deliberately scaled down from a greater original condition? And if so, who made that decision, and what did they say when they made it? The texts will speak for themselves. But first, a word about the people who wrote them. The civilization that remembered everything, the land they called Kiengi, the land of the Lords, sits today under the soil of southern Iraq. It was watered by two rivers whose names we have inherited without quite understanding what they once meant to the people who lived between them. The Trias, the Euphrates, two slow, brown, seasonally violent rivers that flooded, unpredictably deposited fertile silt, and created the conditions for something that, when it appears in the historical record around 5,000 years ago, appears with an almost disconcerting completeness. The Sumerians did not gradually become a civilization. They arrived in the record already organized. By approximately 3200 BC, the city of Uruk, the largest urban settlement in the ancient world at that time, had a population that some estimates place at 40 to 80,000 people. It had monumental temple complexes. It had a professional administrative class. It had an economy organized around the redistribution of surplus goods. And it had writing, a script pressed into clay tablets that began as pictographic symbols and rapidly evolved, within the span of a few centuries, into the cuneiform system that would remain continuous use for more than 3,000 years. The scale of what this means is worth pausing on. The earliest cuneiform tablets from Uruk date to around 3100 BC. They are not primitive attempts at recording. They are highly organized administrative documents, lists of goods, counts of workers, allocations of rations, records of temple property. The system that produced them was already mature when it enters the archaeological record. Scholars debate the prehistory of this development, but the physical evidence presents us with something that arrived in form and function already sophisticated. The Sumerians wrote about their own civilization with what on careful reading amounts to a very specific and very unusual self-standing. They did not describe themselves as having invented their culture. They described themselves as having received it. The text known as the Eridogu Genesis, of which the most significant surviving fragment is housed in the University of Pennsylvania Museum under the catalog designation CBS 10673, opens with a formulation that appears in one form or another across the entire corpus of Sumerian literature. Kingship, wisdom, the arts of civilization, these things descended from heaven. The Sumerian phrase is, and toward from above, it came down. The city of Eridu, which archaeology confirms as one of the oldest urban settlements in Mesopotamia, was described in the texts not as the place where civilization was developed, but as the place where it was first deposited. The word for civilization itself, in its Sumerian conceptual form, is Namlugal, literally, the condition of kingship, but in its fullest sense, something closer to the ordered state of human affairs as established by divine decree. It was not something humans created. It was something that was given to them and which they were charged with maintaining. This framing matters because it is consistent and deliberate. The Sumerian scribes were sophisticated. They were trained inmis called Adaba, the tablet houses where young men spent years learning the cuneiform script, copying literary texts, memorizing formulaic compositions. These were not credulous villagers inscribing folk tales. They were professional intellectuals working within a tradition they understood and debated. When they consistently framed their civilization as received rather than invented, the consistency itself is information. The Weld Blundell Prism, catalogue number WB44, excavated from Lhasa and now displayed in the Asholean Museum at Oxford, encodes this framework most dramatically. The prism is a four-sided clay column, each side inscribed with two columns of cuneiform text. It contains the Sumerian king list, a sequential record of kings, their dynasties, and the lengths of their reigns, stretching from what the text describes as the moment when kingship first descended from heaven to the historical period of the scribe who composed it. The king list divides time into two distinct eras, separated by a single catastrophic event. Before the flood, kings who ruled for lengths of time measured in thousands of years. Their reigns recorded in figures that range from 18,600 years to the reign of Napmenluana, whose 36,000 years approaches something that feels less like a political record and more like an astronomical measurement. After the flood, the numbers collapse post-flood kings' rule for decades, then years. The contrast is architectural, built deliberately into the structure of the text. The CBS 10673 fragment of the Erodu Genesis, translated by Samuel Noah Kramer and subsequent scholars at the University of Pennsylvania, preserves a Sumerian version of the flood, narrative that predates both its Babylonian parallels and its echoes in later traditions. In it, the king's Sudra, the Sumerian Noah, is described as a man of exceptional piety, who received direct divine communication. The text describes his relationship with the divine realm as one of active dialogue. He heard the voice of the god. The god warned him. He acted on what he heard. After the flood, that quality of dialogue is not described as continuing in the same way. The Sumerians appear to have understood their own historical moment as a period of aftermath, as a civilization living in the ruins of something larger, attempting to reconstruct from fragments what had once existed whole. Their texts reach backward, toward a pre-flood era they could not fully access, describe its contents with a kind of reverent incompleteness, and frame the present as a reduced condition, still meaningful, still ordered, still maintained by divine decree, but operating at a level significantly below what had once been available. They were, in the most literal sense of the word, a civilization of inheritors. What they inherited, and what they believed, had been kept from them, is the subject of the tablets we are about to examine. How the tablets were read. Before we can investigate what the Sumerians wrote about the boundaries placed on human capacity, we need to understand how we know what they wrote at all. The cuneiform script disappeared from active use sometime in the 1st century of the Common Era. The last confirmed cuneiform text is an astronomical tablet dated to 75 C. After that, the script was lost, not gradually, but completely. By the time European travelers began encountering Mesopotamian ruins in the 16th and 17th centuries, no living person could read the inscriptions carved into the rock faces or pressed into the clay tablets that occasionally surfaced from eroding mounds. The recovery of cuneiform is one of the great detective stories of modern scholarship, and understanding how it happened matters for any serious engagement with the texts themselves. The breakthrough came from an unusual source. A cliff face in western Iran, near a town called Bisatin, carved into the sheer rock at a height of over 100 meters, accessible only by extreme climbing, was an enormous trilingual inscription commissioned by the Persian king Darius I around 519 B.C. It recorded in 3 scripts the same account of Darius's first military victories and divine authority. One of those scripts was Old Persian, which scholars could partially decipher from later sources. The others were Elilamite and Babylonian cuneiform. The British officer Henry Creswick Rawlinson spent years in the 1830s and 1840s suspended on ropes against that cliff face, copying the inscriptions by hand and paper impression. Working from the Old Persian portion as a key, he eventually cracked the cuneiform syllary, publishing his findings between 1846 and 1851. The academic world now had a door into the written record of ancient Mesopotamia. What lay behind that door was staggering. The great Assyrian capital of Nineveh, excavated by the British archaeologist Austin Henry Lead beginning in 1845, yielded the library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, a royal archive of approximately 30,000 clay tablet fragments assembled in the 7th century BC from scribal copies of texts that were themselves centuries or millennia older. Portions of the Epic of Gilgamesh, portions of the Enuma Elish, astronomical records, omens, medical texts, hymns, legal codes, letters, the entire intellectual inheritance of Mesopotamian civilization, pressed into clay and sealed in a room for 26 centuries. But the oldest layer of that literature, the Sumerian texts, written in a language that the Babylonian scribes themselves had treated as a scholarly classical tongue, dead by Ashurbanipal's time, required a second breakthrough. The nipple excavations conducted between 1888 and 1900 by a joint expedition of the University of Pennsylvania under the direction of John Henry Haynes, with scholarly oversight from the German-American philologist Hermann Hilrecht, produced approximately 50,000 cuneiform tablets and fragments from a single site. A significant portion of these turned out to be the work of the Nippo-Scribal School and Ed Duba, whose students had spent centuries copying Sumerian literary texts as part of their training. Samuel Noah Kramer, working from the University of Pennsylvania Museum Collection, and at institutions across Europe in the mid-10th century, devoted his career to translating, publishing these Nippur texts. His 1944 book Sumerian Mythology and Later History begins at Sumer in 1956, brought the Sumerian literary tradition to a general audience for the first time. Kramer's translations remain foundational, though they have been refined by subsequent scholarship, particularly through the electronic text corpus of Sumerian Literature Project at Oxford University, which has produced new critical editions of the major texts by comparing readings from multiple tablet sources. This scholarly lineage matters for one reason in particular. It establishes that the Sumerian texts we are examining are not interpretations of interpretations. They are, to the extent that any ancient text can be, primary sources. The Atrahasis tablets in the British Museum are physical objects. CBS 167.3 is a physical object. The Weld-Lundell prism is a physical object you can visit in Oxford today. The translations have been produced through rigorous comparative philological work by trained specialists over more than a century. Where translations differ, those differences are themselves documented. What this means for our investigation is important. The textual basis for the 7 capacity limitations we are about to examine is not obscure, contested, or dependent on fringe scholarship. These are some of the most studied documents in the history of archaeology. The question is not whether the passages exist, they do, but rather how we should interpret what they say. The mainstream academic interpretation and the alternative reading both rest on the same clay. The difference is in what questions you bring to the reading. Thoril Jacobsen, the Danish-American areologist whose 1976 book, The Treasures of Darkness, remains one of the most sophisticated analyses of Mesopotamian religion ever written, observed that the Sumerian gods function simultaneously as personifications of natural forces and as political actors, with intentions and agendas. Enlil was the wind, and Enlil was also the administrator. Enki was the water of the deep, and Enki was also the craftsman who designed the human being. This dual nature, natural force, and deliberate agent, is embedded in the grammar of the texts themselves. The gods do not merely represent, they decide. And one of the things the texts record them deciding about is what humanity would be allowed to keep. Theme: the inventory of what was given. In the city of Eridu, at the southern tip of ancient Sumer, there existed a temple complex called the Abzu, the name referring both to the physical building and to the cosmic reality. It represented the underground freshwater ocean, the deep place of origin, the repository of all things before they were dispersed into the world. This was the home of Enki, the god of wisdom and creation, the craftsman of the gods, the designer of the human form. In Enki's Abzu, according to the Sumerian texts, there was stored a collection of objects that had no parallel in the material world. They were called the Me. The word Me, written in Sumerian as a single sign that scholars transliterate into this two-letter form, has no clean equivalent in any modern language, which is itself significant. Samuel Noah Kramer, who devoted more attention to this concept than perhaps any other single scholar, described the Me as the fundamental, unalterable, comprehensive assortment of powers and duties, norms and standards, rules and regulations relating to the cosmos and its cultural processes, to gods and humans, cities and countries. Jacobsen called them the norms. the divine templates that govern the shape of all phenomena, natural and civilizational. But the text that gives us the most detailed picture of what the ME actually contained is not a theological treatise. It is a story about a theft, the myth known as Inanna and Enki, preserved in the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature under the designation T13-1, with source tablets from the Nippur excavations now distributed between the University of Pennsylvania Museum and the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, describes a visit by the goddess, Inanna, to Enki's temple at Eridu. The occasion appears social. Enki receives her warmly. They eat and drink together. The bronze vessels are filled to the brim. The two of them, as the text puts it, started a competition, drinking from the bronze vessels of Ura, and as Enki drinks, generosity overcomes caution. In a sequence that is alternately solemn and almost comic, the god of wisdom, intoxicated, giving away things he will regret giving. Enki presents Inanna with one ME after another. He bestows upon her heroism, power, wickedness, righteousness. He gives her the craft of the carpenter, the craft of the coppersmith, the craft of the scribe, the craft of the smith, the craft of the leather worker, the craft of the fuller, the craft of the builder, the craft of the reed worker. He gives her wisdom and attentiveness. He gives her the kindling of fire and the extinguishing of herb. He gives her deceit and triumph and counseling. He gives her kingship and the royal throne. He gives her going down to the underworld and coming up from the underworld. The text enumerates these gifts in a list format that runs to over 100 items. Scholars beginning with Kramer and continuing through the critical editions have identified between 94 and 11 and 12 distinct ME in the text, though many lines are fragmentary and some natums appear twice in slightly different forms across the surviving tablet copies. This list is extraordinary for several reasons, only the first of which is the sheer range of what it encompasses. The ME are not merely civilizational skills. They include states of being and modes of perception that have no obvious utilitarian function. They include descent to the underworld and ascent from the underworld as functional capacities, not metaphors for death and rebirth, but active abilities that can be transferred between beings. They include venerable old age as a transferable quality. They include what the text renders as attentiveness, a quality of perception or receptivity that in Enki, storehouse was classified alongside kingship and metalwork as something to be held, given, or withheld. The morning after, when the effects of the beer have cleared, and Enki realizes what he has done, he sends his minister Isimud to retrieve the ME from Inanna's boat. What follows is a sequence in which Inanna fends off Enki's envoys 6 consecutive times, successfully preserving what she has obtained. The text records Enki's panic, not as the embarrassment of a god who has given away a few trinkets, but as the alarm of an administrator who realizes that items from a carefully managed inventory have been released without authorization. The ME were not freely available. They were stored, managed, and distributed according to a logic that the texts treat as deliberate and consequential. The fact that Enki kept them in a sealed repository, the Abzu, rather than distributing them, broadly was a structural choice that the narrative takes for granted. Their release required a specific act of transfer. They could be taken, they could be withheld, and the text is deeply invested in which divine figure holds them and which does not. What the text does not say directly, but what the pattern implies, is what happened to the ME that were never released from the Absu at all. Inanna obtained a significant portion of the list, but the text tells us that the list she received was the portion Enki gave in an unguarded moment. The larger inventory remained. The items not enumerated among those Inanna carried away to Uruk remained in the deep water, in the locked temple with the god of wisdom. What was in that remaining portion? The text does not specify in full, but across the other tablets, we will examine across the Atrahasis, the Adapam myth, the Kingless, the Gilgamesh epic, we can trace 7 distinct capacity categories that the Sumerian textual tradition consistently places on the divine side of a boundary that human beings were not permitted to cross. 7 qualities once possessed, or close to possessed, or reachable, that appear in the texts in the context of divine deliberation about what humanity should and should not retain. Each of them has a specific text as its primary source. Each has been studied by mainstream scholars. Each has a conventional interpretation, and each contains in the specific language the tablets use anomalies that the conventional interpretation does not fully account for. We begin with the one that appears first in the Sumerian king list, pressed into the 4 sides of a clay prism, now sitting quietly behind glass in Oxford. The first ability lifespan, Weld Blondel prism, arrived at the Asholean Museum in Oxford in 1931, having been purchased by the English collector Herbert Weld Blondel from the antiquities market and donated to the institution that now bears his name in its catalogue designation, WB 444. The prism is approximately 20 centimeters tall, made of baked clay, inscribed on all 4 sides in 2 columns each. It is one of the most complete surviving copies of the Sumerian king list, and its text was first published by Stephen Langdon in 1923. The document opens with a formulation that appears in one form or another across all the major copies of the king list versions, that include a Nipper tablet, studied by Thoril Jacobson, whose critical edition appeared in 1939 as a Serological Studies 11 from the Oriental Institute in Chicago. The opening line in Jacobson's translation reads, "When kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu." What follows is a list of 8 kings who ruled before the flood across 5 cities: Eridu, Bad, Tibira, Larak, Saipar, and Shurupak. The kings are named, their cities are named. Their reigns are recorded in units called Sa Sumerian sexesimal units of measurement, with occasional additional units in N and Saos. The numbers these produce are very large. Alulim of Eridu, the first king on the list, is given a reign of 28,800 years. Algar, the second king of Eridu, reigned for 36,000 years. The 8 pre-flood kings combined ruled for a total of 241,200 years. The text then records, the flood swept over everything. After the flood had swept over everything, when kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. And in Kish, the first king Joshu ruled for 1,200 years. His successor, Kulachina Bil, ruled for 900 years. By the end of the Kish dynasty, the reigns are in the hundreds. By the time we reach historically verifiable kings, rulers whose existence can be confirmed through independent evidence, the reigns are in the decades. The compression is not subtle. It is the most structurally prominent feature of the entire document. The mainstream scholarly interpretation of these numbers is well established and internally coherent. Jacobson himself proposed, and subsequent scholars including the Assyriast A. Leo Oppenheim have broadly agreed that the large pre-flood numbers should be understood as symbolic. The Sumerian numerical system was sexesimal base 60, and certain numbers carried significance in ritual and astronomical contexts. The numbers associated with pre-flood kings correspond in many cases to sexesimal multiples, and factors suggesting that the scribes were encoding the reigns in a system where numerical magnitude carried theological meaning rather than chronological literalism. The pre-flood kings were divine or semi-divine figures, and their reigns express their cosmic status in numerical form. This interpretation is reasonable. It is supported by the internal consistency of the numbers and by broad parallels with other, ancient traditions where royal longevity functions as a marker of divine proximity rather than biographical record. What it does not fully account for is the structural choice to place a sharp event-specific break between the large numbers and the small ones. If the pre-flood reigns were purely symbolic, the flood narrative itself, which appears in both the Sumerian king list and the connected Eridogenesis, and which describes the flood as a deliberate divine act rather than a natural event, becomes the marker of a transition between 2 qualitatively different states of affairs. Before the flood, one kind of existence. After the flood, another kind. The numbers encode that distinction with great deliberateness. The Epic of Gilgamesh in its tablet X, addresses this transition directly. Gilgamesh, who by this point in the narrative has watched his friend Enkidu die and is traveling in search of the secret of immortality, encounters the tavern keeper Siduri, who offers him what amounts to the most elegant elegy for reduced human life in the cuneiform corpus. The text in Andrew George's 2003 translation from the British Museum tablet sources reads, "When the gods created mankind, they allotted death to mankind, but life they retained in their own keeping." The phrase "retained in their own keeping" uses the same structural logic as the ME passage. Something desirable, something that was once proximate, actively held back by divine decision. Siduri is not describing a natural condition. She is describing a policy. The Gilgamesh narrative gives that policy a very specific physical form. In tablet, she, the flood tablet, corresponding to a later version of the Atrahasis flood story. The survivor, Utnapishtim, the Babylonian Atrahasis, has been granted eternal life as an exception. And he tells Gilgamesh about a plant at the bottom of the sea that the text calls how the old man becomes young again. Gilgamesh dives for it, retrieves it, and intends to bring it back to Uruk to test on the city's elders. But while he sleeps, a serpent emerges from the water and takes the plant. The serpent sheds its skin and disappears. Gilgamesh weeps. In most readings, this episode is treated as a nature myth, an explanation for why snakes shed their skin and why humans age and die. But the specific language of the passage is worth examining. The plant was real. Gilgamesh had it in his hands. The serpent did not destroy it. It took it away. The capacity for renewed life existed in the physical world. It was accessible, and something intervened to remove it at the moment of closest approach. The question the text leaves open not resolved, is whether the flood of the king list and the serpent of tablet C are encoding the same moment from different angles. The specific event at which the capacity for extended life moved from the human side of the ledger to the divine side, and was locked there by a decision that the Sumerian texts record without fully explaining. Across these three sources, the king list, the Eridu Genesis, and the Gilgamesh epic, the pattern of truncated lifespan is not presented as nature's design. It is presented as the result of a transition with a specific cause. The cause is recorded in the tablets. The intention behind it is what the tablets leave very deliberately for the reader to consider. The second ability, direct access to the gods. Of all the texts in the Sumerian and Babylonian cuneiform corpus, the myth of Adapa may be the most precisely calibrated study in deliberate withholding. It exists in fragments, damaged, incomplete, reconstructed across multiple copies from different centuries and locations, and yet its central episode is preserved with enough clarity to make its meaning unmistakable. The story is at its core about a man who was supposed to receive something and didn't, and the reason he didn't is embedded in a single act of misdirection by the god who, in the texts, claims to love humanity most. The Adapa myth survives in four main fragmentary tablet sources. The most significant are a pair of tablets discovered in 1887 during excavations at Tel Amarna in Tu, Egypt, the site of the pharaoh Akhenaten, short-lived capital and catalogued as E356 in what became the Amarna letters collection. These tablets are written in Babylonian Akkadian, not Sumerian, suggesting that by the 14th century BUS, the myth had been copied and circulated as far as the Egyptian court, which itself indicates the cultural weight the text carried. Additional fragmentary sources come from the library of Ashurnipul at Nineveh, held in the British Museum collection. Scholarly work on the Adapa myth has been substantially advanced by Shlomo Israel, whose 2001 monograph Adapa and the South Wind language has the power of life and death, remains the most thorough, critical edition. The story opens with Adapa's identity. He is described as the first of the 7 Apkallu, the antediluvian sages, the fishbed figures, who appear in Mesopotamian art and literature as the mediators between divine and human knowledge. Adapa is the sage par excellence, He had been given wisdom by the god Ea, the Akkadian name for the Sumerian Enki. But, and the text specifies this explicitly, he had not been given eternal life. Wisdom, yes. Immortality, no. The distinction is presented as a deliberate calibration by Ea himself. Adapa serves as a priest at the temple of Ea in Eridu. His duties include fishing in the Persian Gulf to supply the temple's needs. On one occasion, a south wind overturns his boat. Adapa, enraged, utters a curse that breaks the wing of the south wind, and the south wind is silent, for 7 days failing to blow over the land. The great sky god Anu notices this meteorological anomaly, investigates, discovers Adapa, act, and summons him to the heavens to account for himself. Ea knows what is coming, and here, the text does something that commentators have debated for over a century. Ea instructs Adapa on how to conduct himself when he arrives in the divine assembly before Anu. He tells him what to say, what to wear, who to appeal to, and then crucially, he tells Adapa, when you are in the presence of Anu, you will be offered the bread of life and the water of life. Do not eat, do not drink. It is the food and water of death, and it will kill you. Adapa follows this instruction. He appears before Anu, conducts himself well, and is offered, as I predicted, food and drink. He refuses both, and in the most devastating single turn of the narrative, Anu reveals what the food and water actually were. Why did I disclose to a worthless human the ways of heaven and earth, and give him a heavy heart? What he has given cannot be taken back. What he has named cannot be altered. Adapa had been offered the bread of life and the water of life. He refused them following Ea. Instruction, and Anu, unable to undo what the offering represented, sends Adapa back to earth. The scholarly debate about this passage has occupied Assyriologists for generations. The conventional interpretation advanced among others by E. A. Spicer, and more recently by Israel, holds that the narrative demonstrates the paradox of human wisdom, that knowing too much, or pursuing divine prerogatives, ultimately keeps humans from the very thing they seek. The food was genuinely the food of immortality. The scholars agree. The question is whether I deliberately deceived Adapa, or whether warning was made in good faith, and Anu's offer was itself a trick. Israel's exhaustive philological analysis concludes that the text is deliberately ambiguous on this point, that the ambiguity is the point. What neither reading disputes is the structural fact Adapa was positioned by the specific architecture of Ia-Treme, instructions to refuse immortality at the exact moment it was offered to him. Whether that positioning was malicious, protective, or simply the expression of an unbreakable divine boundary around a capacity humans were not meant to hold, the result is the same. The gateway to extended life, to the direct experiential connection with the divine realm, that's the food and water represented, was closed by the word of the very God who had fashioned humanity's wisdom. There is a second dimension to the Adap text that the conventional treatment sometimes underweights. Adapa was not merely a man who lost immortality, he was the first Apkallu, the head of a lineage of 7 pre-flood sages, who according to Mesopotamian tradition documented by the Babylonian priest Berosus in the 3rd century BC, reserved in fragments by subsequent historians, and analyzed by Stanley Burstein in his 1978 volume, Babyloniaca of Berosus, rose from the sea to teach humanity the arts of civilization. These 7 figures, the Apkallu, were the primary conduits of what the texts describe as divine knowledge, transmitted to the human world. Berosus, writing in Greek for a Hellenistic audience, describes the first of these figures as Hoannis, a being with the body of a fish, and the head and feet of a man who emerged from the Persian Gulf and spent his days teaching human beings, writing arts, sciences, agriculture, law and geometry. He gave them an insight into letters and sciences and every kind of art Berosus writes as reconstructed from the historian Polyhista. He taught them to construct houses, to found temples, to compile laws, and explained to them the principles of geometrical knowledge. He made them distinguish the seeds of the earth and showed them how to collect fruits. In short, he instructed them in everything which could tend to soften manners and humanize mankind. The Apkallu lineage, all 7 of them, were active in the period before the flood. After the flood, the tradition records that semi-Apkallu and then purely human scholars maintained the transmission of knowledge. But the lineage was diminished. The fish-garbed figures, who had moved freely between the underwater Absu and the human world, who had carried the ME from Enki's storehouse to the cities of Sumer, were gone. The capacity the Adapics most directly concerns is not lifespan, it is something related, but distinct. The ability to receive direct communication from the divine realm, to stand in the presence of the gods, without an intermediary, to consume the food and water that would have made such communion ongoing rather than occasional. What Adapa lost, or was prevented from gaining, was not merely immortality in the biological sense, it was the sustained perceptual access to a level of reality that the texts treat as existing and accessible, but specifically placed outside the boundary of ordinary human experience. The text does not say that this access ceased to exist. It says that a human being reached it and was turned away at the door by the word of the one who built the door. The third ability, the memory before the flood. In the ruined mound at Nippur, the ancient religious capital of Sumer, a city that belonged to no single political dynasty and functioned as something closer to a sacred neutral ground. Excavators from the University of Pennsylvania, working in the 1890s and early 1900s, uncovered a fragmentary clay tablet inscribed in Sumerian. The tablet, given the catalogue designation CBS 673 and held today in the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, contains portions of a text scholars now call the Genesis, the Sumerian flood narrative that predates the Babylonian Atrahasis and the biblical Genesis accounts. The Genesis is not primarily a flood story. It is a story about discontinuity, about the moment when a specific quality of civilization came to an end and a lesser version began. The flood in the Sumerian account is not a story of punishment and survival. It is a story about the end of an age that had different rules. CBS 1:1673 is damaged. Significant portions are missing. What survives opens in the middle of a divine discussion about the creation of humanity, shifts to the establishment of the first cities and kingship, then describes the decision by the gods to send a flood. The warning given to Zusra, his construction of a survival vessel, the flood itself, and finally, the aftermath in which Zusra is granted eternal life and placed in the land of Dilman. The text is fragmentary enough that some transitions are unclear, but the overall architecture is recoverable. The portion of the text that concerns the pre-flood world describes a period in which the communication between the divine and human realms operated differently. Ziusudra is described as a man who regularly, daily, and constantly presented himself at the divine shrine, attending to the dreams and interpretations of the gods, listening for the word of heaven. His piety is not exceptional relative to pre-flood norms. It is the standard operating condition of his position. Kings before the flood functioned as active recipients of divine communication. The Adapa, the scribal tradition that preserved all of this, described these pre-flood rulers as genuine intermediaries between the human and divine worlds, not through ritual mediation alone, but through a more immediate form of perception that the texts take for granted. What the flood ends in the Sumerian telling is not merely the physical civilization of specific cities. It ends the age of the Apkallu, the 7 pre-flood sages, those fish-garbed figures who move between Enki Abzu and the human world carrying knowledge in both directions, are consistently placed in the pre-flood era. The Sumerian scholar tradition, as documented in a text known as the Uruk list of kings and sages, alike Babylonian texts from the city of Uruk, studied extensively by Wilfrid Lambert, associates each of the 7 Karu with a specific pre-flood king, listing them as royal counselors. After the flood, the list continues with post-flood kings, but the Apkallu are replaced by Umu, human scholars, wise men trained scholars, but not the same thing. The specific quality of knowledge held by the Apkallu is described in the tradition using a Sumerian term that translators have rendered variously as deep knowledge, secret wisdom, or the knowledge of the Absu, the deep water from which all things came. This was not textbook knowledge. It was not the skill of the scribe or the expertise of the craftsman, though those were also included in their instruction. It was a mode of knowing rooted in direct access to the source, to Enki's storehouse, to the inventory, of me, to the place where the norms of existence were kept before being distributed into the world. After the flood, that access did not simply continue at a reduced level, it was structured differently. The Sumerian phrase for what the post-flood scholars possessed was in many texts explicitly differentiated from what the Apkallu had carried. The Humanu studied tablets, they compiled lists, they maintained libraries, they copied the knowledge that the Apkallu had transmitted, but the texts described them as inheritors of a secondary copy, not the primary document. The Uric list of kings and sages makes this distinction in its very structure. The Apkallu and their kings are listed together as a single category. The post-flood kings and their human scholars are listed in a format that implicitly acknowledges the reduction. Berosus, the Babylonian priest, who wrote his Babylonia for the court of Antioch around 280 B, described the role of pre-flood knowledge in terms that have been analyzed by the classicist Paul Schneebel and more recently by Stephanie Deli. The antediluvian sages brought all knowledge at once. After the flood, knowledge was recovered piecemeal from what they had left behind. Barras is explicit that nothing new was discovered, only that what had been deposited before the flood was gradually rediscovered. The post-flood world was an archaeological project sifting through the residue of a greater transmission. This framework, pre-flood knowledge, as a holistic, direct transmission, post-flood knowledge, as partial, mediated, reconstructed, appears consistently across the Sumerian, Babylonian, and to even Assyrian textual traditions. It is not a marginal theme, it is one of the organizing narratives of Mesopotamian intellectual life. The mainstream scholarly view, following Jacobson and others, treats this framework as ideological. The claim to ancient wisdom legitimized the authority of scribal schools and royal courts. If knowledge descended from heaven, if it was transmitted through the Apkallu, then the institution heirs of that transmission, the temples, themes, the royal advisors, carried genuine divine sanction. The pre-flood elaboration of that claim served political as much as theological purposes. This interpretation is credible. Political legitimation through claims of ancient origin is well documented across many cultures. What it does not explain is why the distinction is structural rather than merely rhetorical. The UR list does not claim that post-flood scholars are equivalent to the Apkallu. It explicitly marks them as different. If the purpose were purely ideological, to claim divine transmission, the simplest approach would have been to collapse the distinction, not to maintain it so carefully in the textual record. The care with which the Sumerian scribal tradition preserved and marked the difference between what the Apkallu knew and what their human successors could access suggests that the distinction was experienced as real, not merely asserted as useful. The flood in the Sumerian account was not just water. It was a discontinuity in the quality of human access to knowledge. Whatever the Apkallu had carried, whatever mode of knowing their fishbed figures embodied as, they moved between the deep water and the human world. The texts record its absence from every moment after the waters receded. The fourth ability, unrestricted healing, among the tablets recovered from the nipple excavations of the late 19th century and early 20th century, is one of the oldest medical documents in the history of the world. The tablet housed today in the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology is a palm-sized clay object inscribed with 15 prescriptions in Sumerian. Recipes for treating wounds, skin conditions, and other ailments using plant substances, animal products, and minerals. It dates to approximately 2100 BCE. It is written by a physician who gives no incantations, invokes no deity, and offers no ritual framework. It is in one reading simply a practical medical document. what to do when a wound suits, what to apply when the skin is afflicted. The Sumerian healers call themselves Azu, a word that can be translated as one who knows water, or more loosely, as the one who understands the hidden essence of things. The Azu was the practitioner, the herbalist, the wound-treater. Alongside the Azu in the textual tradition was the Ashipu, the ritual exorcist, whose healing practice relied on incantations, specific verbal formulas, and the invocation of divine authority. In the Mesopotamian understanding of illness, these two traditions were not opposed but complementary. Disease could be caused by physical imbalance and by spiritual displacement simultaneously, and treatment addressed both vectors. But the origin of that healing knowledge in the Sumerian texts is not rooted in human observation and experiment. It is rooted in Enki. The god Enki is described across multiple Koiform sources as the lord of incantation Miki and the physician of the gods Rene. The World History Encyclopedia, analysis of Enki texts, confirms that in the Herpu incantation series, a substantial compilation of magical and medical texts used in Babylonian healing practice, Enki is specifically invoked as the god whose hands created mankind. And it is precisely because he created the human form that he retains authority over its healing. He built the vessel. He understands its maintenance. The Atrahasis text returning to tablets, BM 78941, and its companion pieces in the British Museum collection contains within its complex narrative something that reads in the context of this investigation as one of the most striking passages in the entire cuneiform corpus. In the section dealing with Enlil's attempts to reduce the human population before the flood, a sequence in which the god uses plague, drought and famine in succession, the text describes the first instrument as disease. Enlil released disease upon the people. The scholars W. G. Lambert and A. R. Millard, whose 1969 critical edition, Atra, the Babylonian story of the flood remains a foundational text, translate the relevant passage as describing an organized withdrawal of divine medical protection. The precise Adian term used in the Atra's plague passages is written with the determinative for the divine, marking the disease not as an ordinary physical phenomenon, but as something dispatched, directed with purpose. Lambert and Millard note that in the Mesopotamian understanding, disease was not merely a natural occurrence, but an active deployment of divine capacity, which means structurally that the absence of disease was also a divine provision and its withdrawal was a decision. What this implies in the framework of the Sumerian texts read together is that the healing capacity available to human beings was not simply the accumulated product of observation and practice. It was the residue of a more complete form of divine medical knowledge. The Azu craft, as taught by Enki himself, progressively attenuated as the chain of transmission lengthened from its source. The nipple medical tablet, practically efficient, herbologically coherent, represents the downstream end of a tradition whose upstream end was described as divine. The 1700 years between the Apkallu and the nipple tablet writer is the distance from the source. The Milu series, a major compilation of Babylonian anti-witchcraft incantations, studied in depth by Tierbusch in his 2002 work. The Witchcraft series, MLU, contains repeated formulations in which the healer invokes Enki and Asaluhi, our healer god, who is Enki's son, as the ultimate authorities over disease and its removal. The standard formula, appearing with minor variations across dozens of tablets, runs, essentially, I do not know how to remove this. You know, I do not know what is afflicting him. You know, I call on you. The healer is positioned not as an autonomous practitioner, but as a channel for a healing knowledge that properly belongs to the divine realm and is temporarily accessible through the correct ritual invocation. The mainstream interpretation of this pattern, articulated by scholars including Martin Stoll in his work on Babylonian medicine, treats the divine authority framework as a feature of Mesopotamian religious ideology. Healing was attributed to the gods as a way of reinforcing priestly authority and the legitimacy of the ritual healing tradition. The practical knowledge in tablets like the nipple medical text and the later Babylonian diagnostic series, the Diagnostic Handbook, or Saku, a 40-tablet Babylonian medical compendium, was genuine and often effective. The divine framing was ideological scaffolding around real empirical medicine. This is a reasonable position. The practical content of the Kana for medical tradition is undeniable, and some of its treatments align with compounds and approaches that modern pharmacology has confirmed as biochemically active. But the pattern across the healing texts suggests something the purely ideological reading does not fully account for. The consistent description of a gradient of healing power, in which the further from Enki, direct instruction, the more limited the healer's reign. The nipple tablet writer could treat wounds. The Ashipu of the Babylonian period could treat some diseases through incantation. But the text consistently described categories of affliction, those imposed directly by divine will as outside the reach of human healing entirely. The Atrahasis plague was removed not by physicians, but by Enki's direct intercession. He is the one who persuades Enlil to lift each instrument of destruction. The human healers in the narrative are not described as addressing the divine origin diseases at all. The gradient from Enki's complete knowledge to the partial knowledge of the post-flood healer is in the structure of the texts, a deliberate architecture. The Nippur tablet represents what was available after the Apkallu were gone. The tradition of invocation, I do not know you know, preserves the memory of a moment when the distance between human knowledge and divine knowledge was smaller, when the healing capacity moved more freely between the two sides of the boundary that the flood had reinforced. The fifth ability, the language of the gods. There is a passage in the Sumerian literary composition known as Enmachar and the Lord of Arata that has been compared by scholars, including Samuel Noah Kramer himself, in a 1968 article in the Journal of the American Oriental Society, to the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. The comparison is not exact, but the structural parallel is worth examining carefully because the Sumerian text describes something the biblical account encodes differently, a time before the differentiation of languages and the divine act that ended it. Enmer survives in copies from multiple nipple tablets, the earliest dating to the Old Babylonian period, approximately 2600 BC. Kramer's critical edition was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 1952, and the text is available in full translation in the ECCSL under reference T1, 8, 2, 3. The composition is a heroic poem about a diplomatic contest between Enkar, king of Uruk, and the unnamed lord of the distant city of Arata, somewhere in the region of modern Iran. The two kings dispute trade, tribute, and the favor of the goddess Inanna. In the middle of this political drama, there appears a passage that commentators have consistently flagged as anomalous, a passage in which the god Enki, for reasons that the surrounding narrative does not fully explain, changes the speech of mankind. The relevant lines in Kramer's Te's translation from the 1952 edition read approximately as follows. Once upon a time there was no snake, there was no scorpion, there was no hyena, there was no lion, there was no wild dog, no wolf, there was no fear, no terror. Man had no rival. In those days, the lands of Shoa Hamazi, many-tongued, and Suma, the great mountain of the Me of magnificence, and Akkad, the land possessing all that is befitting, and the Matu land resting in security, the whole universe, the people in unison to enlave praise. Then Enki, the Lord of abundance, whose commands are trustworthy, the Lord of wisdom, who understands the land, changed the speech in their mouths, brought contention into it, into the speech of man, that until then had been one. The passage is brief, and its context in the larger narrative is oblique. It appears almost as a digression within the main story, but its content is unambiguous. There was a time described by the Sumerian poet as a primordial era, when the entirety of humanity spoke in one tongue and praised the god in Lihel, in common, and then Enki deliberately changed this. He brought contention into the speech of man. The mainstream scholarly reading of this passage treats it as a creation myth, explaining linguistic diversity, a Sumerian ethology for why different peoples speak different languages framed as a divine act, in the same way that the Sumerian texts frame all originary conditions as divine acts. Kramer himself, in his Joust article, was careful to note both the parallel with Genesis 11, the significant differences in the Sumerian version. It is Enki, rather than Enlil, who changes the language, and the motivation is not human pride or transgression, but simply a divine decision without the narrative elaboration. The biblical version provides the specific phrase the text uses for the original condition of human speech is worth examining. The Sumerian term rendered as one tongue is Ma, which can mean simply the Sumerian language, but which in this context is used in a way that scholars, including the Asiologist Jeremy Black, have consolated as something closer to the one language or the common tongue. The ME of speech, the divine attribute of language as a transferable capacity, appears in the Me list of Inanna and Enki as forthright speech, and grandiloquent speech, and deceitful speech as separate items, suggesting that the qualities of speech, like everything else in the ME framework, were held in the divine storehouse and distributed according to divine will. What the Emeric text adds to this picture is a specific narrative of transition, a moment when the common speech was functioning, when the human world spoke in concert with the divine order, and when Enki's intervention broke that concordance. The text does not describe this as punishment. It does not describe humanity as having done something to merit linguistic fragmentation. Enki simply decides, and the change is made. The god's motivation is not given, which is itself a feature the Sumerian texts when they describe actions taken by the gods that limited human capacity, rarely provide reasons in the form of human transgression. The limits are presented as administrative decisions, not responses to error. The connection between unified language and direct divine communication is explicit in the passage's structure. The primordial era of one speech is described as the era in which humanity gave praise to Enlil in one tongue. Language and worship and communication with the divine realm are treated as aspects of the same capacity. When Enki changes the speech, he does not merely create French and Sumerian and Elumite. He changes the quality of the channel through which the human world communicated with the Divine One. The ME of speech, forthright speech, the capacity to use language in the way that gods used it, remained in Enki, storehouse alongside the other withheld attributes. What was given to humans after the change was the secondary differentiated contention-laden version. What remained behind the locked door of the Absu was whatever it had meant to speak in the one tongue to address the divine order directly, without mediation, in a form of communication the gods themselves used. The Sumerian scholar tradition did not forget this. The Edda, the scribal academy, taught a curriculum that included the careful reproduction of precise Sumerian formulaic language as a ritual act, not merely as record-keeping, but as an attempt to use language in the way the text described pre-flood language as operating. The exact phrase had power. The wrong word in an incantation was not merely incorrect, it was inert, unable to activate the connection the formula was meant to open. This was not superstition in the way modern usage implies. It was the institutional memory of a tradition that understood language as a technology, one that had operated at a different specification before the gods changed it. The sixth ability, unrestricted knowledge, the withheld me. We have already examined what Enki gave to Inanna in the myth of Inanna and Enki. The long catalogue of me transferred across the table while the beer bronze vessels were drained to the brim. But the more interesting question from the perspective of this investigation is not what was given, it is what was not. The text records Enki's alarm when he soars and realizes what he has dispersed. His minister gives account, my master has given them to his daughter. Kingship, priesthood, the descent to the underworld, the crafts given. Enki's distress is proportional to the scope of the transfer, and yet Inanna's acquisition, however extensive, was a portion of the inventory. The Abzu remained. The locked temple at Eridu still held what Inanna had not reached. The text takes for granted that the storehouse was larger than what was dispersed. The Enki and Ninmah text, preserved in the ETCSL under reference T1. 2 with source tablets from the nipple excavations, provides a different angle on the same problem. In this composition, Enki is engaged in the project of creating human beings with the goddess Ninmah. The text describes a series of creation experiments in which different forms of humanity are fashioned, some incomplete, some impaired, some with specific limitations, and Enki and Ninmah debate what roles each can fill. The myth has been interpreted by Thoril Jacobson as addressing questions of disability and social inclusion in Sumerian society. A reading that is compelling at one level but that leaves open the structural question of why the experiments produce limitation rather than completeness. The key passage for this investigation comes early in the Enki and Ninmah text, where the creation of the first human being is described. The text records that in fashioning the human form, Enki selected the god Gestu A, whose name can be Tourist, the god whose quality is ear, or attention, or in Jacobson's, rendering wisdom as the sacrificial element. Gestu's blood and flesh mixed with clay, from the Absu, became the substrate from which human beings were made. Gestui was in the Sumerian theological framework the divine embodiment of attentive intelligence. The mainstream interpretation reads this as a creation myth, explaining why humans have the capacity for rational intelligence. We were made in part from the substance of a god whose nature was intelligence. This is consistent with parallel creation accounts in the Atrahasis, where the blood of the slain, god Gestui, the Babylonian equivalent, provides the divine element in human creation. But the text specifies that Gestu was a minor god, not one of the great Anunnaki, but a smaller figure specifically chosen because, as the text implies, he could be sacrificed without disrupting the divine order. The quality of intelligence transferred to humanity was not the full intelligence of Enki, or Enlil, or An. It was the intelligence of a specific divine being of limited rank. The human capacity for reason was modeled on a partial template. The Atrahasis text makes this design intent explicit in a way that the scholarly literature has engaged with carefully. In the tablet BM 78941 passage, describing the creation of the human being, the stated purpose is given in terms that W. G. Lambert and A. R. Millard translate as, "Let him bear the yoke, the work of Enlil, let man bear the toil of the gods." The human being is designed for a specific function, labor, the capacity for divine quality intelligence, the kind of knowing the gods themselves employed, is not part of the design specification. What is designed in is enough intelligence to perform assigned work effectively. The phrase, "let him bear the yoke," is not rhetorical. In the Sumerian agricultural economy, the yoke was a device of specific mechanical function. It distributed the load across the shoulders of the animal or human bearer, enabling sustained heavy work. The metaphor is precise. The human being in the Atrahasis design is engineered to carry, not to comprehend. The ME of deep wisdom, the knowledge of the Absu, the understanding that comes from standing in the presence of the source, remained in Enki's storehouse. What was transmitted into the clay was the sufficient for-purpose version. And here the texts present an anomaly that the conventional framing as labor myth does not fully resolve. Enki throughout the Careform corpus is consistently described as the god who argued in favor of humanity, who warned Atrahasis of the flood against Enlil's wishes, who instructed Adapa, however, ambiguously, who created the Apkallu as bridges between divine and human knowledge. Enki is the craftsman who built the vessel and retained the keys. In the Atra's flood narrative, when Enlil's instruments of destruction, plague, drought, famine, flood threaten to eliminate humanity, it is Enki who intervenes each time, finding ways to preserve the human line. The image that emerges from reading these texts together is of a god who is simultaneously the architect of human limitation and humanity's most consistent advocate within the divine assembly. Enki built the boundary, and Enki spent the rest of the narrative finding ways to let things through it covertly, one up at a time. The question of what was deliberately withheld from the clay, what remained in the Absu behind, the locked door, while the sufficient for purpose version was pressed into the human form, is not answered by the texts. It is preserved by them as a question. The inventory exists. The full version is stored somewhere. The partial version walks around under the sun. The seventh ability, perception of the invisible world. In the myth of Inanna's descent to the netherworld, preserved in its fullest Sumerian form, across multiple tablets from the Nippur excavations, of which the tablet designated NI 368, now held in the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago, contains a significant portion. There is a structural device, so precisely engineered that it has become one of the most studied, formal elements in the entire Sumerian literary corpus. Inanna, Queen of Heaven and Earth, descends to the underworld. The reasons for her descent are given in different versions, with different emphases. Ambition, grief, a summons, a desire to attend the funeral rites of her sister's husband. But the structural architecture of the journey itself is consistent across all versions. She must pass through 7 gates. At each gate, she is required by the gatekeeper Neti, acting on the instructions of Ereshkigal, the Queen of the Dead, to remove an article of her divine equipment. At the first gate, she removes the crown of the step from her head. At the second, the measuring rod and line of lapis lazily from her hand. At the third, the small lapis lazily stones from her neck. At the fourth, the golden ring from her hand. At the fifth, the breastplate called Come Man Come from her breast. At the sixth, the golden bracelet from her wrist. At the seventh gate, the garment of queenship from her body. By the time she reaches the presence of Ereshkigal, she is naked and powerless. The text uses the phrase bowed low. She who had been ruler of everything is stripped to nothing. And in the underworld, she is judged by the 7 judges of the dead, the Anunnaki of the underworld, struck with the look of death, killed, and hung on a hook like a piece of meat. The mainstream scholarly interpretation, developed in detail by scholars including Thoril, Jacobson, Diane Wolstein, and Samuel Noah Kramer, in their respective analyses of the myth, reads the 7-gate stripping sequence as a symbolic death and rebirth narrative, a ritual pattern in which the goddess must divest herself of all earthly power before she can undergo transformation in the realm of the dead. This reading is compelling and is supported by the clear symmetry of the myth. Each article of divine equipment is replaced when Inanna ascends, item by item, through each gate on the return journey. The items themselves, however, are worth examining in the context of the ME framework. Each article Inanna removes at a gate is not merely clothing or jewelry. In the Sumerian theological vocabulary, each of these items is a physical token of a specific ME, a divine attribute made manifest in material form. The crown of the step is the ME of sovereignty. The measuring rod and line are the ME of justice and administration. The breastplate is a protective ME. The garment of queenship is the ME of divine status itself. What the 7 gates strip from Inanna, in other words, is exactly what the Abzu storehouse contains. They are the portable wearable forms of divine attributes that have been given physical expression and can therefore be removed layer by layer as the being who carries them descends toward a realm where none of those attributes function. The question this structural parallel raises, not resolved by the text, but implied by its architecture, is whether the 7-gate stripping sequence encodes something about the descent of souls from the divine realm into the physical world, each gate removing one layer of divine perceptual capacity until the fully embodied form is reached. The descent of Inanna uses the same 7-gate structure, the same sequential removal of divine attributes, the same logic of progressive limitation that several later philosophical and cosmological traditions would associate with the soul's passage from a higher-order realm into material existence. The Sumerian texts do not use this language. They do not describe the human birth experience in terms of gates and removals. But the same tradition that produced the descent of Inanna also produced the Apkallu iconography, the fish-garbed figures who are not quite human and not quite divine, who move between the Absu and the physical world, who retain perceptual access to the invisible, order that ordinary humans cannot reach. The Apkallu could see what humans could not. This is explicit in the textual tradition. Their role as intermediaries between Enki's knowledge and the human world, between the divine assembly's decisions and their earthly consequences, between the invisible reality and its visible effects, depended on a perceptual capacity that the texts describe as specific to their nature. They were not humans who had learned to see, they were beings whose constitution included a form of perception that the human design in the post-flood world at least did not include. The MLU and Eru incantation series, both massive compilations of Babylonian ritual text, contain repeated invocations in which the practitioner attempts to access exactly this quality of perception for specific ritual purposes. The Ashipu who performed these incantations was trained to enter a state in which, as the texts describe it, the boundary between the visible and invisible worlds became accessible. The training was the institutional trace of the Apkallu tradition, an attempt to recover, through practice and invocation, and the precise use of the divine language, something that the culture remembered had once been more available. The descent of Inanna describes that capacity, the ability to perceive the invisible world, to move between its layers, to carry divine attributes as functional equipment, as something that can be stripped away gate by gate. And by the time the myth's logic is followed to its natural conclusion, the question it leaves behind is not about Inanna's return journey, which the text records in satisfying symmetry. It is about the human figure who descends through 7 gates of limitation into material existence, and who does not have a faithful minister waiting outside to negotiate the return. What the Sumerian texts preserve in the 7th ability, they consistently describe as having moved to the divine side of the ledger, is the memory of a different quality of human perception, one that reached further, saw more, and understood the relationship between the visible and invisible world, not as a mystery, but as a geography with a map kept in Enki's storehouse in the deep water, where the lights from the surface grow faint, and the large inventory waits undisturbed. The pattern across the tablets, we have now moved through 7 distinct categories of human capacity, each anchored in a different cuneiform text, each examined through its own disciplinary lens: lifespan in the king list, direct divine access in the Adara myth, pre-flood memory in the Eridu Genesis, healing in the Atrahasis, language in En in Merkah and the Lord of Arata, deep knowledge in Inanna and Enki and Ninmah, perception in the descent of Inanna. What distinguishes these investigations from a simple anthology of Mesopotamian mythology is the structural consistency across independent sources. These texts were not written by the same hand. They were not found at the same excavation site. They were not composed in the same century or even the same millennium. The Weld Blundell prism dates to approximately 2000 BC. The Adapa tablets from Tel Mana are 14th century copies of earlier material. The Atrahasis, in its oldest surviving form, is Old Babylonian, around 1700 BC. The Nippel tablets, from which much of the Sumerian corpus derives, spans several centuries of copying from a tradition that may stretch to the 3rd millennium BC. And yet across all of them, a pattern runs with the regularity of a structural feature rather than a coincidence. Each of the 7 capacities is described in its respective text not as something humanity never had, but as something that was either withheld at the moment of creation, removed at a specific transitional moment, placed behind a boundary that was deliberately set and maintained, or lost through a mechanism that the text describes as involving divine action. The king list uses the flood, the Adapa uses I's instruction, the Eridogenesis uses the Apkallu's departure, the Atrahasis uses the yoke metaphor and the plague's withdrawal, and Merkah uses Enki's direct change of human speech. The ME texts use the locked storehouse. The descent of Inanna uses the 7 gates. Different mechanisms, same direction, from more toward less, at a moment of divine decision. Thoril Jacobson, in The Treasures of Darkness, observed that Mesopotamian religion organized its understanding of the divine as fundamentally concerned with power, with who holds what capacity, and under what conditions. The gods were not simply beings who possessed qualities, they were administrators of qualities, and the distribution of those qualities across gods, humans, and the natural world was itself a form of governance. The ME framework is not a theological ornament. It is a description of how the Sumerians understood reality to be organized as a system of distributed capacities, each held somewhere, each theoretically transferable. Within that framework, the question of what is held in the Absu and what has been released into the human world is an administrative question, not merely a metaphysical one. Enki keeps the inventory. Inanna obtained a portion of it. The Apkallu carried portions of it to the human world before the flood. After the flood, the conduits were closed, the Apkallu were gone, and the human world operated on what remained. W.G. Lambert, whose decades of work on Babylonian wisdom literature established him as one of the central authorities on the cuneiform intellectual tradition, noted in his 1960 Babylonian wisdom literature that the Mesopotamian understanding of the relationship between divine and human knowledge was consistently asymmetrical. The gods knew more, and what they knew was in principle accessible to humans only through specific divine permission. The whole apparatus of the Babylonian divination tradition, the reading of omens, the interpretation of dreams, the observation of celestial patterns, was understood as an attempt to read, imperfectly and partially, a text that was fully legible only to those with complete divine perception. This is not primitive superstition, it is a coherent epistemological framework. Knowledge has a source. The source is held elsewhere. Human access to it is mediated and partial, and the full version is somewhere that ordinary human experience cannot reach. The three interpretive positions available to the careful reader of these texts are genuinely different, and each deserves to be held without premature resolution. In the first reading, the pattern is mythological, a symbolic architecture in which the gods' limitation of humanity encodes the human experience of finitude, impermanence, and the limits of knowledge. In this reading, the seven capacities are not literal abilities, but existential conditions: mortality, ignorance, fallibility, the opacity of the sacred. The Sumerian scribes built a cosmos in which these conditions had a story, a cause, a set of actors, because a condition with a cause is bearable in a way that a condition without a cause is not. The myth is wisdom teaching dressed as history. In the second reading, the pattern encodes a philosophical or spiritual tradition about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to the divine. The ME, the Absu, the seven gates. These are maps of an inner landscape in which the human being carries a latent capacity for perception and connection that is normally, in ordinary waking life, inaccessible. The Apkallu represent the possibility of full access. The post-flood human represents the ordinary, contracted state. The entire cuneiform tradition is an attempt to preserve the memory of what full access felt like, and to maintain the practices incantation ritual, the careful use of the divine language, through which partial recovery remained possible. In the third reading, the pattern documents something that the Sumerians understood as historical as their preserved memory of an actual transition from one condition to another. In this reading, the pre-flood era was qualitatively different, not because the scribes invented a golden age to make the present more bearable, but because the Sumerians genuinely remembered in their institutional tradition that something had changed. The Apkallu were not metaphors. They were a class of beings whose departure, whether through the flood, through a withdrawal of divine presence, or through some process the texts can only describe in the language available to them, left a measurable gap in human capacity. None of these three readings is the obvious one. None of them is impossible. Each is supported by different aspects of the textual evidence and the pattern across the govable. That consistent orientation from more toward less, at a moment of divine decision, does not disappear when you move between interpretive frameworks. It is structural. It is in the clay, what the mainstream says, and what it leaves open. Any investigation that takes the Kine form record seriously owes a serious engagement with the scholarship that has built its understanding. The academic consensus on Mesopotamian religion and mythology is not the enemy of careful reading. It is the necessary foundation of it. To understand what is genuinely anomalous, one must first understand what is genuinely explained. The mainstream scholarly position on the 7 capacity themes examined in this investigation can be summarized fairly and without caricature as follows. The pre-flood lifespans in the Sumerian king list of sexdecimal symbols, not chronological, claims. Thoril Jacobson's critical analysis in Assyriological Studies 11, 1939, demonstrated that the numbers used for pre-flood reigns are consistent with the mathematical conventions of the Sumerian numerical system, in which specific multiples of 60 and its factors carried cosmological significance. The point of the pre-flood list was not to record actual reigns, but to express the divine proximity of the primordial kings through the language of large numbers. This is a scholarly consensus, not a speculation. The Adapa myth is best understood as a philosophical reflection on the paradox of wisdom. The gift of deep understanding which Ea gave Adapa is separate from the gift of immortality. The story explores why the wisest of humans remains mortal, not through divine hostility, but through the structural condition of being human, in which wisdom and eternal life are different kinds of endowment. Israel's 2001 work makes a compelling case that the text is ambiguous about Ea's intent, precisely because the ambiguity is philosophically generative. The story teaches differently depending on how you read's motivation. The Apu tradition represents the ideological legitimation of the scribal class by claiming descent from pre-flood sages who received direct divine knowledge. The Babylonian scribal schools claimed authority over knowledge transmission and interpretation. The distinction between Apkallu and Umianu in the Uruk list is not a record of an actual, qualitative change in human capacity. It is an institutional boundary, the original divine teachers versus the human practitioners who inherited their tradition. Wilfrid Lambert's work on the scribal tradition and more recent studies by Martin Lang have documented this function thoroughly. The American Ethology, an origin story explaining linguistic diversity using the standard Mesopotamian frame of divine causation. Kramer's Gios analysis and subsequent work by Gerald Cooper on Sumerian literature treats the passage as a political text, addressing the relationship between Sumerian civilization and its neighbors, the many tongue glands around it, rather than as a memory of an actual linguistic event. The ME framework is a theological administrative concept, not a literal inventory of transferable capacities. In Jacobson's analysis, and in the work of Benster and other scholars of Sumerian literature, the me are best understood as the abstract norms that define the proper function of social and cosmic institutions. Kingship is a me because it has a normative form. What kingship is supposed to be? The craft of the scribe is a me because it has a canonical form. The me list, in Inanna and Enki, is a theological catalogue of civilization's component parts, not a description of abilities that can be physically stored and physically removed. The descent of Inanna's 7-gate structure is a literary device. The most elegant example in the Sumerian corpus of what scholars call ring composition, in which a narrative descends through a series of linked elements and then ascends back through them, in reverse order. The stripped attributes are literary markers of Inanna, progressive humiliation and powerlessness. Their restoration on the ascent marks her rehabilitation. The symbolic function is what matters. These are serious arguments. They are made by serious scholars working from the primary texts. They do not represent intellectual laziness or incuriosity. They represent a century of rigorous philological work, trying to understand what the Sumerians were doing when they wrote. What they leave open is a narrower but genuine set of questions. The sexesimal interpretation of the kingless lifespans explains why the numbers are what they were. Within, it does not explain why the structural break the flood is consistently placed at the point of numerical reduction across every version of the list rather than at some other structural division. If the numbers are purely symbolic, the choice of the flood as the dividing line between long number and short number reigns remains a deliberate structural choice by the scribes. And it asks why the flood, why not some other divine event? The adapter interpretation as philosophical paradox is persuasive as a reading of the myth's effect, but it does not fully account for specific instruction. The verbal content of the deception, if it is deception, being addressed to the first of all, the figure who most directly represents the channel between divine and human knowledge. The myth's philosophical content and its institutional content may not be separable. What it teaches about wisdom and mortality may be inseparable from what it teaches about who controls the channel through which divine knowledge enters the human world. The me, as theological administrative concept, explains the function of the list in its institutional context. It does not explain why the CCSL text in its most careful translation treats the items in the list as physical objects that can be loaded onto a boat and stolen not as abstract norms, but as things, with weight, portable enough for Inanna to carry, and Enki to attempt to retrieve. The physical specificity of the me transfer, the boat, the repeated attempts at seizure, the 7 episodes of recapture, pushes against a purely abstract reading. The descent of an Anna as ring composition identifies a literary structure. It does not explain why the items removed at each gate correspond precisely in the me vocabulary to the divine attributes that would make the descending figure capable of perceiving and acting in the invisible world. The symmetry of the composition is literary. The specific content of what is removed is theological. Both are true, and they do not cancel each other. Andrew George's 2032-volume critical edition of the Babylonian Gilgamesh epic, the most thorough philological treatment of that text ever produced, carefully notes in its analysis of Tablet X in the Siduri speech that the line life they retained in their own keeping is a statement about divine policy, not divine nature. The gods retained life. They did not merely have it. The grammatical construction implies an active choice to keep, rather than a passive condition, of being immortal. George does not draw the implication explicitly, but the grammar supports it. The mainstream interpretations are not wrong. They are the best current scholarly consensus, and they carry the weight of serious evidence. What they leave open in the specific textual anomalies identified above is a set of questions that the evidence raises but does not require the mainstream to answer. Those questions are where the investigation lives. If the texts are literal implications, there is a particular kind of intellectual discipline required to follow an implication seriously without claiming it as conclusion. The cuneiform record, as we have examined it, presents a coherent pattern. 7 categories of human capacity, described across independent and widely separated textual traditions as having been either withheld at creation or removed at a specific moment of divine deliberation. The mainstream scholarly interpretation explains this pattern as mythological, symbolic, and institutional. The anomalies in that interpretation, the physical specificity of the me, the grammatical precision of the divine retention of life, the structural placement of the flood at the numerical break in the king list, do not constitute proof of an alternative. They constitute unresolved questions. But the discipline of following implications requires asking. If the Sumerian scribes were not writing mythology, if they were not constructing institutional ideology, if they were instead recording as accurately as their conceptual and linguistic vocabulary permitted the memory of an actual condition and an actual transition, what would that mean? If the pre-flood lifespan figures encode a real biological or physiological condition rather than numerical symbolism, the implication is that the Sumerians preserved a memory of a human population whose relationship to biological time was fundamentally different from what we observe in the post-flood record. This is not a claim about genetics or physiology in the modern sense. It is a claim about what the Sumerians believed they remembered, and what the structural logic of their most careful historical documents was designed to preserve. If the Adapa myth records something more than philosophical paradox, if it encodes the memory of an actual severing of the channel between direct divine communication and the human sensorium, the implication concerns the quality of human perception at the boundary between what we conventionally call the rational and the intuitive, the visible and the invisible. The Apkallu tradition places the transmission of civilization precisely at this boundary. Beings who could cross it freely brought the me to the human world. When they stopped crossing it, civilization became what it has been since the flood. Brilliant, complex, and cut off from the source. If the flood of the king list is not only geological but epistemological, if it marks not just a physical catastrophe, but the specific moment at which a different quality of civilization came to an end, then what was lost is not merely the cities of the pre-flood world, none of which have been found, but the organizational principle that made them different from what came after. The Sumerians named that principle with extraordinary consistency, knowledge that came from above, transmitted through specific beings, organized according to the norms held in a divine storehouse. The implications for how we understand human origins are within this reading profound and genuinely unsettling in the most constructive sense. The conventional model of human development is accumulative. We start with less and build toward more. The Sumerian texts describe the inverse, a starting condition of greater capacity, deliberately reduced to a working minimum followed by millennia of attempting to recover what was taken. Berosus, writing for a Hellenistic audience in the 3rd century BC, states this explicitly. Nothing new was discovered after the flood. Everything was a recovery of what had been deposited before it. The implications for the concept of human potential are perhaps the most quietly challenging aspect of this reading. If the 7 capacities described in the Sumerian text were real, if lifespan, divine communication, pre-flood memory, unrestricted healing, the original language, deep knowledge, and expanded perception were genuinely part of the human design before the divine administrative decision reduced the specification, then what we experience as the limits of human possibility are not the full picture. They are the yoked version, the sufficient for purpose version. This is where the investigation holds its most careful position. This implication is neither endorsed nor dismissed by the texts themselves. The texts describe the reduction, they record the divine deliberation, they preserve the inventory of what is stored in the Apkallu, and what was pressed into the clay. What they do not say, what no cuneiform inscription says in any collection with any catalogue, number in any museum, is that the reduction is permanent, or that the storehouse is empty. The descent of Inanna ends with return. The stripped attributes are restored at each gate on the way back up. The pattern of the myth, followed to its formal completion, suggests that the loss and the recovery are both part of the same structural motion. What descends also ascends. What is removed for the descent is available for the return. Whether that is mythology, philosophy, or history, is the question the Sumerian scribes pressed into the clay and left for whoever came after. The clay remembers. It is very quiet where you are now. The tablet catalogue number BM 78941 sits in a museum case in London. A clay palm fired hard in the ancient sun, covered in marks that no one could read for 2,000 years. The building around it breathes with the slow temperature of climate control. Outside, the city moves far above the city. The satellites pass, and the clay remembers what it was told. 4,000 years ago, a scribe in a city that no longer exists sat with a wet tablet on his lap, and pressed a stylus into it, copying for the 1,000th time in the scribal tradition's history. A story about a meeting between gods, about a decision made in an assembly, about 7 things that the design of the human being was calibrated not to contain in full. He finished the tablet. He set it to dry. He probably copied another one before the day was over. He was not writing mythology from his perspective. He was preserving a record. Whether that record is myth or memory, whether the Sumerian scribes were encoding philosophical wisdom or historical documentation, or simply the institutional ideology of a priestly class. These are questions that the tablets do not resolve, and that the scholars who study them have not resolved. In 2 centuries of careful work, the clay holds the question, as well as it holds the answer. What we can say with reasonable confidence is this: the Sumerian civilization, the oldest literate civilization in the archaeological record, consistently described the human condition not as the best version of itself, but as a reduced version, not as a species climbing toward its potential, but as a species operating below a capacity it had once been closer to. The things that limited human life, the brevity of years, the opacity of the divine, the fragmentation of language, the partial quality of healing, the inaccessibility of deep knowledge, the barrier between ordinary perception and the invisible world, were not in the Sumerian telling features of the design. They were decisions made by specific figures, at specific moments, recorded in specific texts, with specific catalogue numbers. The inventory exists. The ABZU still holds what was not released. The storehouse at Erdu, in whatever form it now takes, contains the full specification of what the clay was made to be before it was told to bear the yoke. You have heard the evidence. The pattern is in the tablets. The tablets are in the museums. The museums are in cities you can visit. The clay is older than the cities, older than the museums, older than every interpretive framework that has been applied to it. What you make of the 7 things the gods kept, and whether keeping them was the final word or the beginning of a much longer story, is yours to decide. Wherever you are tonight, the question is the same one the Sumerian scribes pressed into the clay, and the clay remembers